Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's NAESP webinar on Data and Relationships Can Strengthen Your School's Response to COVID-19. And now I'll turn it over to Gracie Branch, NAESP's Associate Executive Director.
Hi everyone, I'm excited to be here today. We have an esteemed panel today that's going to talk to you about data and relationships. We always hear about the importance of data-driven decision makings, and they're going to talk about the data you have at your fingertips today that can help you in your response to the challenges being presented by COVID-19. So today we have with us Hetty Chang, the Executive Director of AttendanceWorks, Erica Ganay, the principal at Earl Boyles Elementary School, David Douglas School District in Oregon, and Chandria Richmond Roberts, the principal of Harrison Elementary School in Pomona Unified School District in California. And then behind the scenes today, we have Catherine Cooney, who is the Associate Director for Communications for AttendanceWorks. Catherine's going to be manning the chat box this afternoon. And then I want to give a shout out to Honor Feedy, who you heard at the beginning of this webinar, who's on our PL staff at NAESP and does all the behind the scenes technical work bringing these webinars to you. So thank you all for being here today, and let's get started with our webinar.
Great. It is such a pleasure to be here. What a privilege, Gracie, and honor to help launch this series for NAESP. As Gracie mentioned, I am the Executive Director of AttendanceWorks. Next slide, Honor, please. And we are a national initiative that really focuses on advancing student success and closing equity gaps by reducing chronic absence. Broadly defined, chronic absence is missing so much school that students are at risk. We know they're at risk academically, and we know that missing so much school may be an indicator of other risks. And our charge is helping people to use that data point to engage in prevention and early intervention. And what we know is that that data point, while we've defined it before as sort of whether you're missing 10% or more of school generally, it still holds true even when schools are closed, even though we're going to have to figure out other ways of monitoring and measuring when kids are actually not in whatever we've now come to define as school in this new age. And I also wanted to mention that at AttendanceWorks, we do have a website resource page on the coronavirus where we will put up information, including things like this webinar, and NAESP is going to be putting up resources, but we just wanted to make sure that you also knew we had some that with a whole variety of resources that was constantly updated. Next slide, please. What we know is that schooling has changed at almost an unfathomable pace. This is when I first looked at the, EdWeek has an amazing map, and this was March 14th. We're not even talking a month ago. And at that time, by the way, the first school district closed, major school district closed on March 11th. That was Seattle Public Schools. In 3 days, we went from one school district to 20 states, plus Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. 3 more days later, we had 35 states, plus Washington, D.C. Next slide. This is yesterday's documentation. We now have 17 states and 2 U.S. territories saying that school buildings will be closed for the rest of the academic year, and schools in every single state at this very moment are closed. No one would have imagined this was possible. I think even on March 11th, when the Seattle schools closed, none of us could have predicted this rapid pace of change. So the question is, how do we respond? Next slide, please. I also want to get a sense from all of you before we keep going. tell us, what's the name of your district, your school, state, and how long do you know your schools are closed for? So Pennsylvania's closed for the rest of the year. I'm hearing that from Rafael. Thank you. We've got some places, I think Corinth closed till March 4th. We have other places till March 30th. We have an amazing, I'm now realizing I am almost struggling to read the data coming in so quickly, but you can see such a huge array of differences. May 30th, March 4th, April 30th, May 4th, all the way through the end of the year. So one thing is clear in this country is how this is playing out in each one of your places actually varies. Some places already know they're closed. Other places suspect they're closed, but all they've gotten is we're closed till these next 2 weeks or the next 3 weeks. And we're all doing a little bit of reading the tea leaves as to how long this is going to last. I also just want to say I so appreciate all the work that is going on to respond quickly to this crisis. As educators, as principals, you are all on the front lines of this work. And we know that you are being amazing in all the different ways that you are taking on this challenge. Let's go to the next slide. So what I want you to think about is that as you take on this challenge, you don't have to completely start from scratch. You can still use data like chronic absence, which actually you have through the time of school closure, because this is something that is required reporting now under ESSA. Even though ESSA as an accountability measure may be waived, you have this data point, and it's incredibly useful for understanding who might need more support, even as you seek to respond to this crisis. Chronic absence has been defined as missing 10% or more of school, including all reasons, excused, unexcused, and suspensions. Next slide. We know that it's an important data point because it signifies that students are academically at risk and need support. Next slide. It also reflects existing equity gaps. Kids who are vulnerable, who are living in poverty, who have were less likely to have the resources to make up the time lost in the classroom, were more likely to be chronically absent. And I would suggest those kids who were chronically absent prior to COVID-19 are the ones that are particularly at risk now that schools are closed. They were already struggling with food, housing issues. They were already struggling with the fact their families didn't have the resources to make up for lost time in the classroom when it happened due to other reasons other than COVID-19. And even though we don't have assessment data, even though we may not have other data, we still have this data point. And it may be one of the best data points we have to guide our work as we move forward. Next slide. Prior to COVID-19, Attendance Works came up with this framework for understanding chronic absence. The idea was that if kids didn't show up regularly to the school, it was an indication that they might not be experiencing these positive conditions of learning. They might not have or feel physical and emotional health and safety. They might not feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support to the school. They might not feel academically challenged and engaged. And they might not be surrounded by adults or students who can support this. When you had high levels of chronic absence, what we wanted folks to do was unpack what isn't in place. Is it not in place because of what's happening in the school or because of what's happening in the community? And what does that mean for positive problem solving? And what I would like to suggest is that this framework continues to hold true now. What we now need to think about is, as we move to remote learning, what does it mean to put in place these positive conditions for learning? How do we, even if it's not through physical contact, ensure emotional health and safety, belonging, connection, support, academic challenge and engagement? And how do we make sure that our staff, because they're struggling too, this crisis has an impact on everyone, can support each other and support their kids in making sure these positive conditions of learning continue to exist. Next slide. We know that when you have high and extreme levels of chronic absence, this is an alert that more needs to happen. So your levels of absenteeism can help you think about, what do you need to put in place in order, what's the level of energy, what's the level of expertise to put in place those positive conditions for learning. And again, I think you can use your data to think about what that's going to mean in remote learning situations. Next slide, please. Principals can also cultivate a school-wide approach that supports prevention and early intervention, and take a team approach that helps you to do this. And I want to also draw back, and I realize to something about the phases of responses to COVID-19, which let me go, and this is the phases of response that you as principals are going to be taking through your schools through. The first phase of the response is deciding whether schools are closed, right? And that is what people have been in right now. The second phase of response is actually thinking about how you're going to reach out to families to make sure they get access to those supports, the resources, maybe making sure that they have access to remote learning opportunities. And in that response is when you can use this chronic absence data to see who might need more supports. The third phase of the response is, while schools are closed, how are you going to support engagement in learning, right? How are you going to make sure kids still get access to what they need? And the fourth phase of response is going to be preparing our kids back for the transition to school, which is going to possibly be the hardest transition we've ever experienced. And for a lot of kids, that's going to be about re-engaging them in a learning experience. But we also have to think about how what we do now as we reach out to families is going to support continuing to engage them while schools are closed, and having the information and the data we need to think about what's a really effective transition plan back for our school, for our community, for our students, for our families. And while everyone is key to that, principals are especially essential, because how we do this is going to require a school-wide approach that supports prevention and early intervention. How we do this is going to take a team approach. It's not going to be because one person can do this. If ever we have a time where we need everyone on board working together, both the school staff, but community partners, district, this is the time. We can address unprecedented challenge when we work together. And as I know Erica and Chandria, who will be joining me in a moment, know, this required building staff capacity to do things that we've never, ever done before. But we will rise to the challenge, because I believe every teacher is here because they want what's most best for their kids. Every school staff, teacher really broadly defined. And we are now clear we have to learn new approaches to teaching, to learning, to connecting. But as principals help to inspire that approach, inspire that learning. And we can use data in our communications, in our decision-making, whatever the phase it is, whether it's data for closure, whether it's data for outreach, whether it's data for sustaining engagement and learning while schools are closed, and whether it's about how we transition our students back to school. So with that, can we go to the next slide? I am so pleased to be joined by Erica and by Chandria. They are two amazing principals. They have the most warm, engaging, welcoming schools. I've had the privilege of stepping foot on both of their school campuses. They're the kinds of schools that when you walk through the door, you feel the positive energy. You see the norms plastered on the walls, and both of them have been such incredible leaders. They do work in a bit of different contexts. Erica is in Earl Boyles outside of Portland. Chandria is in Pomona outside of in the larger LA area of California. I'll let them each talk a bit more about their schools. But I'm just so glad you get to hear from both of them, because I know you'll be inspired, as I have over the course of time that I've had to work with both of them. So Erica, let's start with you first. Why don't you say hello and tell us a little bit about Earl Boyle?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I welcome you to the webinar. I won't be able to see all of you, but I'm certainly glad to be on this webinar with all of you to learn together. As Hetty mentioned, my name is Erica Ganay, and I'm the very proud principal of Earl Boyles Elementary School. If we can click to the next slide, it does have the demographics on it. Just to let you know where Earl Boyles is, it's in Southeast Portland. It's about 12 square miles. We have 9 elementary schools in our district. We have 3 middle schools, a very large high school, and an alternative high school. In our school at Earl Boyles, we have about 530 students, less now, of course, which is preschool grade, which is age 3 through grade 5. We have about 30 languages that are spoken in our building, which is about 28 different countries in the home represented. We have about 75% of our families that do qualify for free and reduced lunch. And it's a beautifully diverse community with lots and lots of cultural wealth and assets that our families do bring to us. I think one of our strengths is we're a very collaborative and a collective community, and that we have established partnerships and strong family engagement over the 12 years that I've been at Earl Boyles. And we're fortunate to work in a district that supports those values of relationships first. So again, thank you for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Erica. And Chandria, why don't go to the next slide, please. Tell us a little bit about your school and community.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chandria Roberts. I'm the principal at Harrison, have been there for 7 years, but I've been fortunate to be a student there. I attended the school site from grades 2nd through 6th, so I'm a proud Tiger. I currently serve in Pomona. We are a larger district than Erica's district. We have 41 schools and we have 29 elementary schools. My school has 384 students, and we are a pre-K 8th grade school. So we have a large group of needs. Our community predominantly speaks Spanish, but I do have a population of students that speak Arabic as well. We're 94% free and reduced lunch at our district, at my site, and 30% of my kids are considered homeless. So we service a vast need of students, whether they live in the motel or if they live in a program called Prototypes. I'm 80% Hispanic, and then my next largest group is 11% African American, and we have 20% of our students who are considered and identified as English learners. So like Erica, we build our relationships. We take it very serious when it comes to building relationships with our community. I've been there 7 years, and I've had the pleasure of watching the community come together and truly meet the needs of our students as well as our families. So again, I'm proud to be part of this webinar, and I look forward to engaging in a conversation with the panelists and you as well.
Thank you so much. Anna, can we go to the next slide, please? So we're going to have this as an interactive dialogue throughout. And so just folks who know, so you know or have a heads up about what's coming, we're going to have questions. I'm going to start by asking the question. You see the question on here, but I'll repeat it out loud. For Erica and Chandria, we'll have them respond. And then we're going to try to turn to folks and have them describe what's going on in their own situations. And we'll try to keep track of what's happening in the chat box, though I will admit the pace of that chat box makes it a little hard to read. So we'll do our best here. And I will also just make sure that you guys know both schools are public schools that are featured right now on this webinar. I just wanted to make sure people were aware of that. So let's start with Erica. Tell us about the priorities for you as a school leader in this very challenging time. What are the shorter and longer term priorities? And how does this relate to your district's guidance and supports for responding to COVID-19?
Sure, Hetty. So I can speak to our district, and basically when the governor came out and gave guidance around school closure, one of our district's first response was to gather together and to consider, like, how do we roll this out, knowing what our core values are around relationships. So one of the first things that was we did was to connect with our families, and we did that in a very collective manner. We had a script that we used with all of our teachers. The very first week, they used a script to call our families, their families that they had relationships with, to check in with them around how they're doing, and they had specific things that we were looking for, basically just to connect, build that relationship virtually, and then to ask things like, what are the needs, what are the barriers you're experiencing? They asked questions about technology, internet devices in this classrooms, and if it came up, questions around housing, food insecurities, and then that information was documented into a district-wide Google Doc, so that we could start looking at and determining what the barriers were that families were facing. And so we use that to kind of determine how do we start thinking about getting devices into the hands of students, organizing and coordinating food services at pantries, and thinking about our resources that are available within our district so that we can coordinate that without overtaxing our current systems. And the district played a key role in this, and our staff was amazing. So what we did is the district created that framework based on the governor's guidance, and we rolled that up. Number one priority being relationships first, so that primary connection, data collection around barriers, and then coordination of services through the district utilizing that data that was collected. And then also thinking about what is the longer term, knowing that what is learning going to look like at home, because that prompted us to start thinking about the difference between supplemental learning, which is not new learning, but learning that has been covered and supporting families at home, versus distant learning, which is new learning, and what is that going to look like? And then also thinking about that all through an equity lens, like what is that going to look like for families that may not have access to internet or opportunities or cars to get to food pantries. So really thinking that through a bit. Then also thinking in a next phase, long-term too, what does that ongoing professional development look like for our staff? Because we're setting up Google Classrooms and moving at a very, very fast rate of learning. You know, everybody's in this race together, taking that first step together, our families, you know, our staff, our district office, our state. And so really thinking about what that looks like for professional learning for teachers. So for example, doing really quick on-the-spot turnarounds, like how do you set up a Google Classroom? What are legitimate resources that we can do online? And continuing that professional learning around what does online and offline look like, what does a schedule look like for a day, and understanding this whole time, like the pressures on our families, you know, being really, really sensitive to what's going on, not just in taking our classroom and what our environments were in the classroom, but really thinking about what that looks like at home for families. So again, you know, that again, building relationships, figuring out barriers, aligning resources, such as, you know, grab and go meals, creating supplemental versus distant learning, creating professional learning opportunities for our staff online. And again, that coordination for us with our district office, you know, and it's thinking about that cascading communication, how it goes and flows through all of those different levels is really important. So all the way down to how that, and always, you know, thinking about the student as the core, like how is this going to impact the student? I think those are some of our long-term and short-term goals. So, and again, it ties back to our values of relationships and, you know, putting the child at the core and center of all of our decision making.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Chandria, how would you answer this question? What are your short-term, long-term priorities? How does that connect to Promoting Unified's guidance to you?
So our short-term goal was to definitely make sure that we connect with our community, making sure that they understand that the relationship that we have built will continue. So first priority was making sure that our kids have the devices that they needed in order to be successful when we started our distance learning. Making sure that the community knew that we had a grab and go meal program set up for the whole community, and making sure our parents knew exactly where that location was, and getting any questions answered when it comes to the needs of the kids, the social emotional needs. So making sure that we connected that way, and understanding that the parents knew that we were still here in the long haul for their students. So that was our first priority. We had a distribution of hot spots in our laptops, making sure that they, again, had everything that they needed. And then for our long-term goal, it was definitely making sure that we met the distance learning needs of our kids. And so with that being said, our teachers underwent professional development in looking at apps and resources that are available in order to meet the diverse needs that we have within our school district. We have a large population of English learners just across our system. So what is that going to look like for them? Servicing our special ed students, what will that look like? Reassuring the community that school will continue to go on until May 29th, even though the brick and mortar building is closed. Making sure that they know that there's resources in the community that'll meet their needs when it comes to food pantries and when it comes to Wi-Fi, and connecting them that way, and understanding that if we have the relationship that we say that we have, we're going to be able to get all this done together, that we're truly a partner, that we have not forgotten them. We have Zoom meetings with parents. I have a coffee with the parents, coffee with the principal Zoom meeting scheduled once a month, so that the parents know exactly what's going on when it comes to decision making for our district as well as our school site. And then that way I can get a feel on what is out there in the community, what questions do they still have, what concerns are still there for them, and making sure that I get those answered. We use a school class dojo school-wide, so I'm constantly looking at the types of questions that are being posed by our parents when it comes to our teachers. Connecting with my teachers once a week on a Friday. We do have that opportunity to meet with them for an hour, and making sure that they're okay. Because again, my relationship with them is going to impact their relationship with their kids. So making sure that I know their needs, and that they know that I'm still here, even though we're Zooming, I'm still here for you, and communicating with them that no matter what, we're in this together, and together we're stronger. And so making sure that the whole community understands that. Our district has messaged that as well. It's a constant communication being uploaded on our district email, so that no one is left wondering, now what do we do? Who do we reach out to? Where do we go from here? COVID-19 will pass, but we will substand, and we will surpass this together. That's the only way we're going to get through it together. And so messaging that, and our district is partnering with us as well. So I think we're going in the right direction, but we still have work to do. We're still learning like Oregon, but we're confident that together we'll be okay.
Thank you so much, Chandria. I am going to turn to the chat for a second too. And one thing I would like to know, people to know that unfortunately the questions on the chat are not recorded by Zoom. So I'm going to go through some of the questions, and we will be able to talk about it. I did see a lot of comments where people are involved similarly in getting tech devices out to make sure people have access to that. There were also a number of folks that actually don't have access to technology, so their school districts are mailing that information out. Some people have managed to do some surveying, looking at where they are. Like I think this is talking about that they had surveyed so that they could then address those issues. Certainly grab and go meals, figuring out how to even use buses to get out to kids. Those are all parts of what people were talking about, making sure that they take advantage, this is back on the tech side, of Spectrum and Comcast, who are offering, free access to internet services. These are all things that people are doing. Clearly people are having to, employ a whole variety of creative approaches. There was a question, I think this was to Chandria, it's about the coffee hours, and I think this is, as I know all of you are probably watching all the Zoom security concerns popping up on the internet. The question is, how do you make sure that your interactions are secure? And I'm going to actually broadly ask both Erica and Chandria, both interactions with families, but certainly these security issues are coming up fast and furious. Chandria, can you talk about startup first and then go to Erica?
Yes. So I conducted my first Zoom before all of this hysteria came out around Zoom, right? And so how I connected with the family is definitely through Class Dojo, letting them know that I was going to have a coffee with the principal using the Zoom resource tool. And so the parents logged in using their own personal email that I have, because that's on our Zango, which is the system that we use when the parents enroll their students. So that's their personal email. And so it's voluntarily, because I can't guarantee anything because it is technology, but I do let them know the concerns that are out there, and then they can come in. I had over 150 parents log in. And so that didn't seem to be a concern. Our district is now looking at a program called Soft Phone, which will make it a little bit easier because it's a more secured system. And so I will be transitioning to that in the month of May, because I will have a coffee every month. But right now, when we had it the first time, they understood that it was their emails that they were taking that risk, per se. But we didn't have an issue, and so any other information that I needed to give out, I could push out through Class Dojo if they were concerned and didn't want to be part of Zoom. So they didn't have to be part of Zoom, but if they really wanted to see me, then that's the tool I was using before all the hysteria came out about Zoom.
Erica.
Sure. So our district made a commitment to use Google Classroom because we can put some securities in place for that, and it was a district-wide decision that was the platform that they would support. And so from that, what we're doing is, and Chandra is a little bit more ahead of me, but what I've been doing is joining into all of the classrooms, the Google Classrooms for our staff, and on their front screen, what I do is create a message from the principal, like, good morning, it's Mrs. Ganay, glad to see you. And I've been uploading videos to that, so it's more, it would be like I was doing a morning announcement. I've started my own Google Classroom, and I'll probably open it up to school because then it would be secure for families to be able to interact. And I probably will be doing something like office hours as well for families, because I think it's important that at this point families do have access so they can get their questions answered, and because we're all in it together, right? And we may not have all the answers, but I think it's really important that they have access to us, to our staff, to resources. So we are all using Google Classroom. There were some questions around for us in platforms, like for preschool, what is an appropriate platform for little ones who don't have the typing skills yet? And so we're thinking about things like, there's a couple out there, there's Blooms and Seesaw that people are really liking, and so I'm meeting with our preschool teams, schools this afternoon to kind of talk that through, which is the best platform to use, but being sensitive to, just like Chandrea was saying, you'd be really upfront with your families that, you know, this could be a site that, you know, we don't know the protections that we know like would be in Google Classroom.
Great. I was wondering, just before we shift to a second question, which we'll get at some of the comments, Honor, might I briefly share my screen? I realized that I was missing a COVID response slide that I'd actually like to share. Could I have a moment to share my screen? Thank you. And I want to take people to that slide. So let me do that for a moment. And talk about it, and then I'm going to go into the next slide. So this is a, let me get it into slideshow mode, a way of thinking about the responses of COVID-19 that I mentioned earlier, but sometimes it's helpful to me to have a visual. So we just went through the decision to close. A lot of this conversation that we've just been having has been about the second phase, outreach after school closure, the need for supports, connecting families to learning supports, determining access to technology, starting to think about behavioral and emotional and maybe physical health, especially as people figure out what's happening with telehealth, because we're still working with how to do virtual, but respect confidentiality issues. And there's this use of data, of leveraging data to think about how to triage, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. And then we're going to be moving into this support for engagement during remote learning, and I think you all are trying to figure out what are all those platforms as well that can support that, what's a variety of resources that can you use with connectedness and engagement as a key component of this, and then eventually we're going to go to the transition back to schools. I just wanted folks to be aware of and keep in this framework of these phases, and how what we do in phase 2 has to set us up for phase 3, and what we do in phase 3, like document challenges and interventions, has to set us up for phase 4, because eventually our kids will come back to us in person as well as virtual. So I'm going to stop on a moment for that, but I wanted to give that context. And now let's move into the second question. Honor, can you put back up the slide deck?
Eddie, while you're doing that, in the chat box, when Chandrea was talking about the new platform she's going to move to, her voice kind of dropped. I didn't hear that, and I think some of the participants didn't either. So do you mind repeating that for us?
Yes, so the platform that we'll be moving to is called Soft Phone. We were trained on it on Monday, and we'll be transitioning as of Monday, April 13th.
Okay, and then can we go back one slide, Honor, to question B? Thank you. This is going to connect to, I think, a lot of the comments that are coming up in the chat. Which families might need additional support? And how have you used chronic absence data to inform outreach and support? And I'm going to add another one, which is also coming up in the chat. And how do you coordinate outreach to the families so that we don't overload parents with 10 well-intended calls, but that the family is now not going to respond to any of us because we're like worse than robocalls, right? Chandrea, do you want to offer up, how are you using this information? And then we'll go back to Erica. And part of it is, I know in your case that one of the things, how I know Chandria, is we worked with Pomona Unified to create a nice little widget on their classroom, on their Q data system, so that we know that your teachers can pretty quickly see what are the levels of chronic absence, and you can see it for all of your kids as a school. So this is data that you have access to. But tell us more about who are those families who may need additional support, how are you using chronic absence data, and how are you ensuring coordination?
Okay, so my families that I know that need additional support are definitely my kids that live in the motel and my students that are part of Prototypes program, which is a substance abuse recovery program for our mothers. So we know that those are students who need that additional support. The data, the chronic absentee data, also indicates that they're the ones who are chronically absent at my school on a regular or tardy, right? So the way we've been looking at the data is taking a look at who are those kids. Prior to COVID-19, we were doing visits to the homes, we were making phone calls, we were setting up meetings, we were having parent conferences around the importance of their kids attending school daily, right? And so now with COVID-19, they're at home, and I know that one of the concerns would be the grab-and-go meals, making sure that they have food, looking at resources that are in the community for paying their bills, because a lot of our parents were already struggling. So what resources are out there to connect them to getting some of their bills paid? Definitely making sure that they have the vouchers that are going to carry over in the motel to sustain them. And then who makes those phone calls? Okay, how do we coordinate that? So I've been working very closely with my school counselor, with my resource teacher, my office manager, and myself. What we do is every day I have a Google Doc that the teachers have to input what kids hadn't they heard from on that particular day. And so we divvy up the names, and then we make contact to find out, hey, is the student okay? Is there anything that you need, family? We didn't hear from you today. We haven't touched bases with you. Please call us back. We'll leave a message. We don't just leave a message. We also come back and make that phone call if we haven't heard from them. And then if there's any needs that the family has indicated, like a couple of families have shared with us that the student is appearing to be depressed. So our counselor is connected with that particular student and family, and then we connect them with our district director for mental health, trying to get those resources within the community to them. It is very, very, very purposeful, because if we call too much, these are families that typically are not accustomed to coming to school and having the school that involved. But again, because of the relationships that we've established with them, they trust us enough to allow us to assist. And so with that being said, we make sure that we're very mindful of how we're communicating with them and how frequently we're communicating with them. And the parents have all returned our phone calls. They thanked us for connecting with them. But again, it shows that the relationship that we developed before COVID-19 are going to carry us through COVID-19 long as we stay the course. And the course is making sure that the whole child is okay. If they're not okay at home, they're not okay. They're not going to be okay at school. They're not going to be okay with distance learning. And so I've even had kids email me just to say hello. They've emailed me because they have some blocks. We have a security on our computer system, so they want me to unblock some of the games. And they promise to do their work if I unblock these games. So that's good to know that they're trying to connect with me. And I reassure them that I need them to learn, and that any games that's available that I feel are going to potentially meet the needs of their learning, then I will take it to the district to have them blocked. And so we go from there, but it's good to see that they understand that I'm there for them and that their teachers are there, and we're just going to continue to connect that way.
Chandra, before we move to Erica, talk a little bit about your homeless kids, because you had shared with me earlier that you had maybe 10 kids who've actually moved out of district. What happens for them?
So our students that are, I have 30% of my kids are considered homeless, and they potentially live in the motel. So we have had 10 families share with us that they have moved out of our area. My teachers have contacted me, and they're like, well, what do I do? So I share with my teachers to share with the families. I don't care where you live, you have a device. Stay connected with us. Make sure that they're doing the distance learning. Make sure that if you need any type of resources, we're going to get you connected to anyone that can meet the needs of the family and the kids. Because right now there is no brick and mortar, so they really can't go and register anywhere. And so I would rather have them learning with us than not having anything, because that's exactly what is going to happen, because they're so used to putting school on the back burner. So we're just going to stay connected with them, and then whenever COVID-19 allows us the opportunity to go back into the buildings, then we'll get them connected with their district that they're currently residing in. But right now, they're mine until we can get them situated in a situation in another district.
All right. Erica, how would you respond to this question?
Sure, yeah. So just to jump in, we also, again, like Chandra said, the relationships are absolutely key. So when we think about this particular question, and like where we started as a data point using our chronic absentee data, that's where we started. We knew the families that were already having a difficult time for whatever reason, you know, homelessness, a variety of reasons that were difficult and having a hard time coming to school, or barriers that were there. So we already had some pre-established relationships and systems set up into place. We did use that data, so we knew who those families were. So when we were making those connections, we, you know, picked up that relationship where we left off to figure out what the barriers were to move forward. So we have used that. And, you know, if you think about this, like we had talked about in the past, like we have had, if you think about a tiered system of support within your building, you know, in the past you just have a certain percentage, maybe 10%, 12% of chronic absenteeism overall for families, but now we have our whole community in crisis. So really thinking in terms of how do we think about serving and delivering supports in a tiered system. So like, what are we doing for all of our students? What are we doing for some of them and just a few of them? And when I think about that, so like when we started our phone calls, really we created that document to be able to think in terms of a tiered system. What are we doing for all? We're making connections, we're determining needs, and then we took that information and we chunked it out. So then I have outside agencies and partners that would pick up that piece of information, and teachers knew that, because we had a staff meeting just last week and talked about this, which partners were picking up which piece for support based on that data that was collected. So for example, for housing, if we had a family that was losing their housing, we have a sustainability specialist that works with short-term housing. That person then, the teacher would say, hey, can our person contact you around supports in this? And the family's like, yes, of course. And they have already have that relationship. So we would be connecting them up. And then we had a separate document that got into more intensive services so that teachers were aware of families. But it was never a cold call. It was always based on relationships and interactions. You know, and really considering like where to start.
Erica, can I follow up on a couple questions, because I saw some things in the chat.
Sorry, I know it's hard for me to think about following that.
Yeah,
okay.
SNAP, unemployment benefits, suicide supports. Are there other kind of supports that you have in place? And how do you make, just talk again, how do you make sure people, you know, there's so many issues that could come up. So both, it's great that you have community partners, but how do you know, and what's the role of the district when something comes up that might be something you hadn't encountered before? So can you talk a little bit about that broader array of supports too? Sure,
yeah. So for example, again, it's all about that relationship and connection with the family. So we really rely on that first line of, because our teachers do home visits and connections, so they talked about that established relationship, maintaining that established relationship and level of trust that's there, because then chances are we're going to hear more about unfortunately, the mental health crises that are going on in our homes right now. And this is a good thing, because then we can align them with, I know our counselors have come together as a district and kind of committed to, like, what kind of social emotional learning and supports around mental health can we provide in the schools. They have already reached out to teachers. Teachers know that is their first level of link. And so then the counselor, just as we would in a school day, the counselors would then reach out to the families to provide that support and wrap around services for them. Same with mental health services. We're able to, I know our mental health therapist is doing Google Chats with their clients, continuing those services and bringing on new clients as needed. Everybody's just stepping in, and there's a real, like I say, there's a systematic approach so that to minimize the amount of, I think it is overwhelming for families too, because they're getting all kinds of emails and there's a lot coming at them. So having that point person be a trusting person in which they have a relationship with, and oftentimes that is their classroom teacher, to be that point person, and then the classroom teacher has to know how to connect into the resources that are available within your school or district, depending on what they are, and having some kind of a mechanism in which to do that. And for us, it's again that communication document that we will continually refer to, and then case manage as we can. And we have something called a service coordination team at our school that that's where we filter all those big questions. Our counselor sits on it, our after school child care our provider sits on it, our housing, we have somebody from early childhood. So we come together and kind of look at how are we case managing those pieces based on that data that's collected from that point person, which is the classroom teacher.
I'm going to add another wrinkle, but I'm going to turn it to Chandria to start this off. What about kids in special ed, Chandria? What's happening for them, and what does it mean? Because historically, kids in special ed have also had high levels of chronic absence. And there are so many challenges that might be related to ensuring kids with disabilities continue to get supports.
So we just had a Zoom meeting with our director of special ed this week. And so we're actually rolling out our distance learning effective Monday, April 13th. Her team shared with us the plan of the sample lessons, the idea of what the instructional piece will look like for them. I'm fortunate to have 2 ed specialists on my campus to service my special needs students. And so because I am a school where it is inclusive. So I don't have SDC. I have more your mild, moderate needs that need to be met, but I have a lot of social emotional needs. So a lot of my kids are identified as emotionally disturbed. And so with that being said, my psych, our school counselor, my 2 ed specialists, we've been taking a look at the document that was just recently shared this week. And then what does that look like when it comes to coordinating services for speech? Because I do have a speech therapist. What is that going to look like? I think the easiest way of doing it is having them be co-hosts or co-teachers in Google Classroom, and then servicing their students based off of what the objective is for that particular IEP goal. Also them having their own Google Classroom. Our counselor has her own Google Classroom so that she can continue to have those sessions with her students around the needs that came up for their IEP. Our psychologist will also be part of those sessions just so that she can be a consultant when it comes to servicing our students. Our speech therapist is part of that session because she has to have groups of kids that she's identified as having some very similar needs when it comes to speech services. So we're right now in the planning phase, but I think we have a good handle on how we're going to service our kids. Everything is changing so rapidly, but we want to make sure that we stay compliant when it comes to servicing our students. Because again, a lot of my students that are identified are based off of a social and emotional need. And so looking at that, we're making sure that we connect with even families, because what we know is they have a diverse need academically, but they also have behavior needs that are going to be overwhelming and stressful for the families at this time because they're dealing with life. right? And so my counselor has also been setting it up to where next week she'll just have a consultant session for the parents. How's it going? Giving the parents strategies on maybe ADHD students or ADD students or students who are identified with a mood disorder. And so having those conversations with them in private and collectively so that they understand, again, we're still here. We're just not in the brick and mortar, but we're still here to service our kids.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I am going to turn to the last question, which is, what is key to partnering with families? And are there any lessons learned from your work to reduce chronic absence? But Erica, I'm going to ask you to start this off. And in a conversation that you and I had earlier, you talked about the changing nature of our partnership with families. I would love you to, if you could start off with that frame and then talk about lessons learned from chronic absence.
Sure. I mean, through all of this, I mean, you know, we've always talked about families and parents being the child's first teacher. And that is so true more now than ever. And it's up to us as educators to honor that fact and to really be considering, you know, if we're keeping that child at the core and the center of all of our decisions, and we both are, and we are partnering with our families in a much different way, right? So we're used to that control and environment in our classroom, and we set up the lessons, where people sit, and what those instructional strategies or practices will be. Right now, we don't have control over that. Really, what we have control over is how we are relating to our families right now and providing support and instruction so that we are honoring, and this gets to that equity issue, you know, what we're honoring, what their home environment looks like, and how are we setting up instruction so that we are in that relationship, in a trusting relationship with the families, right? So that we're delivering instruction and content so then that they can take that into their homes and really make it meaningful to the children. We need to meet them where they're at, wherever that is, with no judgment and being able to move forward. And I think the lessons learned around reducing chronic absenteeism, I apologize, I'm talking fast because I know we're coming to an end, but is really that fact that you have to maintain that relationship and trust in order to move anything forward in a positive direction with our families, because as soon as judgment enters the picture or barriers come right back up, there will never be any way that we can get around that. So just maintaining that relationship, that's one lesson learned from reducing chronic absenteeism. And again, honoring that the family is the child's first teacher and that environment. We cannot underestimate using the resources that are there. I know Zaretta Hammonds has a lot of work around thinking in terms of what is culturally responsive teaching practices, and she talks a lot about that. So those are just some of the lessons that we've learned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am actually going to need to shift this to Youth Gracie to wrap this up. Erica and Chandria, let me just say you've been amazing. So many insights to offer the field, and it's been amazing to watch the side chat going there too. And Gracie, you want to wrap it up?
Sure. I just echo Hetty's sentiments. This has been amazing. You all are on the front lines. You're doing great work. And so proud that we were able to get this information out to principals. We'll have a recording. It will be posted online at the NAESP website. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Hetty and Erica and Chandria and Catherine, even though we didn't see you. Thank you for being with us.